The quiet
For your
medic, there are
selfless
moments
dedication,
that
we are
divide a
forever
life into
grateful.
before and after, not the ones you see coming,
You deserve
not the ones
this.
you prepare for with training
Is
and
that
prayer,
all you've
and
got?
the careful construction
even
of
close.
contingency
Let's
plans.
see then.
The
You're
ones
on.
that arrive without warning in
Thank
ordinary
you, dear.
rooms on
Of
ordinary
course.
mornings
Let's get you
and change
upstairs.
everything
I've got this side.
before you
All
even
set?
have
Yes,
time
thank you
to
both.
understand what is happening.
Good morning.
Bud
Let's
Hadley
begin
had
with
seen
patient
his
handoff
share of those
protocols.
moments.
Remember,
He
safety
was
and
72
communication are
years
our
old.
top priorities.
He had served with
Everyone,
the
watch
82nd
closely. Airway
Airborne
clear,
Division.
starting confast.
He had
100
jumped
per
out of
minute. Count with
aircraft
me.
into
Good.
darkness
Now,
over
AED pads
Grenada
on. Stay
in October
focused.
of 1983, holding his breath and trusting a piece of nylon above his head, landing in terrain that had not been accurately mapped and proceeding anyway because the mission required it. He had buried friends. He had carried guilt the way old soldiers carry it quietly, without complaint, folded into the chest, where it stayed warm and never quite cooled down to nothing. He was not a man who impressed easily. On the morning of the Federal Oversight Committee hearing, Bud Hadley sat in a plain chair at a plain table in a government building in Washington, D.C. His hands were folded in front of him. His face showed nothing. He wore his good jacket, the dark one he kept for occasions that required it, and he had polished his shoes the night before with the methodical attention he gave to things that deserved doing properly. A committee member leaned forward and asked him to describe what he had witnessed on the morning of March 14th at Harmon Veterans Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Bud was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his folded hands. Then he looked up. "I've seen things," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that words carried more weight when you didn't rush them. "In my time in the Army, in my 40 years since, I've seen people do things that shouldn't be possible. Things that didn't fit the situation, didn't fit the body, didn't fit what you thought you knew about how the world worked." He paused. "What I saw that morning in 1.8 seconds, I have never seen anywhere else. Not before, not since." He said nothing more. The room was silent. "And we have to go back 3 weeks back to a cold Monday morning in March, back to the beginning of something that none of them, not Bud Hadley, not Dr. Garrett Mercer, not Warren Cole himself, saw coming. Part 1, Harmon Veterans Medical Center sat on the western edge of San Antonio like something the city had built out of obligation rather than love. It was not a glamorous facility. The parking lot had cracks running through the asphalt that had been filled and refilled so many times they looked like old scars. The waiting room had chairs that had been reupholstered twice in 20 years and still managed to look tired. The fluorescent lights in the east corridor buzzed faintly at a frequency that seemed specifically calibrated to produce a low-grade headache by noon. But it was a place that mattered. The men and women who came through its doors came with real wounds. Not just the visible ones, the missing limbs, the surgical scars, the hearing aids, the tremors in hands that had once been steady. The invisible ones, too. The ones that showed up in the eyes when a door slammed unexpectedly, or in the hands when paperwork asked you to relive something you had spent years trying to fold away into a place where it couldn't reach you during ordinary hours. The staff who worked there knew this. Most of them had been there long enough to understand what they were treating and what they were not. They were not just treating bodies, they were treating histories. On the morning of March 3rd, a Monday, a woman walked through the main entrance of Harmon Vibe MC, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and wearing navy blue scrubs that were clean but not new. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 119 pounds. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple knot and a face that suggested she had learned to make it unreadable a long time ago. Not blank, not cold, but settled like a surface after the wind has passed. She walked with the stillness of someone who was always watching, always cataloging, always filing information away for later use, without any visible indication that she was doing so. Her name was Kate Donovan. She had transferred from a facility in North Carolina 3 weeks earlier. Her file said she was a registered nurse with 2 years of civilian experience, following 6 years in the United States Marine Corps, where she had served as a combat medic. Staff sergeant, honorable discharge, multiple commendations, a record so clean it looked polished. The file did not say much else. It did not say that she had treated traumatic wounds in conditions that most emergency room physicians would consider unworkable. It did not say that she had kept men alive with her hands and her training and nothing else in the dark and in the dirt while the world came apart around her at distances that did not leave room for hesitation. It did not say what she had carried out of the Marine Corps and into her civilian life, folded down small, tucked away, held back by a promise she intended to keep with the same discipline she had brought to everything else. The file said new nurse. Start date March 3rd. Report to the 3rd floor nursing station. She found her way there without asking for directions. She stood at the station for a moment, looking at the layout, the sight lines, the traffic patterns, the way a person looks at a space before entering it rather than after assessing what it was and what it was likely to require. A nurse named Lily Prescott was the first to acknowledge her. Lily was 24, 2 years out of nursing school, with the kind of face that still showed everything she felt before she had decided to show it. She smiled at Kate and offered her hand and said welcome in a way that was genuine but also faintly apologetic, as if she were welcoming someone into a situation she already felt bad about. Kate shook her hand. "What do I need to know?" Kate asked. Lily opened her mouth, closed it, glanced down the hallway. "The charts are in the system," she said carefully. "Rounds start at 7:30. Dr. Mercer does the East Wing." It was not an answer to the question Kate had asked, but it was an answer to a different question. Kate filed it away. She walked the floor before rounds without a guide. She didn't introduce herself to every person she passed. She watched instead. The way the nursing staff moved slightly too quickly, with a tension in the shoulders that had nothing to do with the ordinary demands of the work. The way they listened for sounds coming from further down the hallway. The way conversation dropped a register when someone in a suit appeared at the far end of the corridor and then came back when the figure disappeared into an office. In room 314, an elderly man was struggling with his oxygen tube. It had shifted slightly during the night, and no one had adjusted it. He was too proud to press the call button again. Kate could see that in the set of his jaw, and too uncomfortable to simply wait for a scheduled check. She walked in without being summoned. She adjusted the tube with two precise movements. Checked the flow rate, looked at the man directly. "Better," she asked. He exhaled slowly. Nodded once. She walked back out. No one had seen her do it. That was fine. She hadn't done it so someone would see. Lily Prescott had seen it. Two other nurses near the station had seen it too. They said nothing, but they looked at each other with an expression that carried a question neither of them was ready to ask yet. In room 308, an 80-year-old man named Harold Walsh was sitting in a wheelchair near the window. He was watching the parking lot below with the patient attention of a man who had lived long enough to find ordinary things genuinely interesting. He had large, weathered hands resting in his lap and a face that had been shaped over decades by weather and labor, and something heavier than either. He wore a small pin on his collar, an American flag, and beside him on the windowsill was a photograph in a simple dark frame. The photograph showed a woman in a nurse's uniform, young from another era entirely. She had a direct gaze and a quality of calm that was visible even in the old photograph's limited resolution. Kate passed the open door and noticed him without stopping. She noticed the photograph. She noticed the wheelchair and the medical ID band and the labored but steady quality of his breathing. She noticed the way he sat upright despite everything with a discipline that came from a long time ago and had never quite been surrendered. She kept walking. She did not know his name yet. She did not know his daughter's name or his daughter's position on the board of this facility or what his continued survival would mean to a great many people in the weeks ahead. She just noticed him, filed the image, moved on. That was enough for now. Warren Cole appeared in the hallway at 8:47 in the morning, and the floor changed. It was a physical thing, not metaphorical. The atmosphere of the third floor shifted when he came around the corner, the way barometric pressure shifts before a storm, measurable, unmistakable to anyone who had learned to read it. The shift moved through the nursing staff like a current. Shoulders tightened, voices dropped. Eyes found the floor, the charts, the walls, anywhere that was not his face. Cole was 57. He had a large frame going slightly soft at the edges, a gray suit that cost more than most of his nursing staff made in 2 weeks, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been meaningfully held accountable for anything. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who considered every space he entered to already belong to him because in his experience it did. He was the director of Harmon Veterans Medical Center. He stopped at the nurse's station and picked up a chart without asking. He scanned it for 10 seconds. His face moved through displeasure the way a sky moves through weather, gradually at first, then all at once. "Who signed off on this discharge summary?" he asked. No one answered immediately. "I'm looking at a room full of people." Cole said, his voice still measured the way a fist is still measured before it swings. "Someone signed this." Lily Prescott raised her hand slightly. She was the newest nurse on the floor after Kate and Cole had the instinct. That was the only word for it, instinct, the unconscious selection of the easiest target to turn toward her. He walked to where she was standing. He picked up the clipboard she was holding. He looked at it for a moment, his expression doing the thing it did when he was about to make a point that required an audience to understand. Then in a single controlled motion, he threw it. Not at her, beside her at the wall, 4 inches from her face. The sound was sharp and flat like a crack with no echo. Lily did not move. She could not move. The instinct that produces movement, the instinct that said, step back, raise your hands, protect yourself, had been systematically removed from her over the past 2 years, in this building replaced by something smaller and worse. She stood completely still, her face white, her eyes fixed forward. The hallway was silent. Every person in it had gone very quiet. Cole said, "You have until this afternoon to redo every chart in your section. The format is not a suggestion. It is not a preference. It is a standing requirement." He looked around the hallway slowly, the survey of a man confirming that everything in his environment remains in its proper position. "This applies to everyone." He walked away. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Then slowly the hallway resumed. Hands began working again. Voices came back in low registers. The current passed and left the aftermath in its wake the way currents do. Kate Donovan was standing 12 feet away. She had not moved during any of it. She had not looked at the wall where the clipboard had struck. She had not looked at Lily Prescott. She had kept her eyes on Warren Cole from the moment the clipboard left his hand to the moment he disappeared around the corner. And she was still looking at the place where he had been. Dr. Garrett Mercer appeared at her shoulder. He was 52, with the kind of face that had probably been open once and had since learned to close. He had spent 18 years at Harmon 5MC, and the years showed in the economy of his expressions. Nothing given freely. Nothing wasted the careful management of a man who had spent a long time in an environment that punished transparency. He looked at Kate, looking at the empty corridor. "Don't," he said. Kate turned toward him. "Don't what?" she said. Mercer held her gaze for a moment. "Whatever you're thinking." He walked away. Kate watched him go. She said nothing. But she had heard not just what Mercer said, she had heard what he knew. She had heard years of knowledge in 2 words, the compressed weight of a man who had watched something happen for a long time and had run out of ways to warn people about it. She filed that too. The flashback came the way her memories always came, quietly, without announcement, usually when her hands were occupied with something precise. This time it arrived while she was checking a patient's IV line in room 311, her fingers moving through the motion with the automatic accuracy of someone who had performed it 10,000 times in conditions ranging from adequate to catastrophic. She was 19 years old. She was in a hospital room in Beaufort, South Carolina, and the room smelled like antiseptic and something underneath the antiseptic that she had not allowed herself to name directly. Her father was lying in the bed. He was smaller than she had ever seen him, and she was aware of this in the way you become aware of a structural change in something you thought was permanent, not dramatically, but with a quiet, spreading recognition that rearranges everything around it. Thomas Donovan had been a Navy corpsman, hospital man 2nd class, HM2. He had deployed with a Marine Infantry Battalion during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, 27 years old, and assigned to a unit moving through the oil-smoked darkness of Kuwait, providing emergency medical care in conditions that no training ever fully prepares a person for. He had treated bullet wounds and blast injuries and the specific category of trauma that comes from being in the wrong place, when ordnance that was designed for maximum damage finds its range. He had come home with no visible wounds, which had seemed like a straightforward good thing for a long time. It was not a straightforward good thing. Gulf War syndrome had taken him slowly and then with increasing speed. The respiratory problems, the neurological symptoms, the immune dysfunction that his doctors cataloged carefully and could treat only partially, all of it traced back to the burning oil fields, the depleted uranium, the chemical agents that had moved through the air of Kuwait in 1991 and had decided in their indifferent chemical way to take up permanent residence in the bodies of the men who had breathed them. By the time Kate was in high school, her father was managing it. By the time she joined the Marine Corps at 18, following a path he had laid without consciously intending to lay it, he was declining in ways that he refused to make dramatic. He went to his appointments. He took his medications. He sat on the back porch in Beaufort and watched the marsh grass move in the afternoon wind and told her things about medicine and about the body and about what it meant to use your skills in service of something larger than yourself. He died in the summer of 2017. In the hospital room that last afternoon, he had held her hand with both of his, a grip weaker than anything she had felt from him before, but deliberate, present, still entirely him. He had looked at her for a long time before he spoke, the way people look at things they are trying to memorize before the light changes. "Use your hands to heal," he said. She had nodded. "Promise me." "I promise," she said. She had meant every word of it. She had carried the promise through the remainder of her Marine Corps service, And through her discharge and through 2 years of civilian nursing, it traveled with her the way his voice traveled with her, folded into the back of her mind, present, always guiding the direction of her hands toward the work he had asked her to do. She returned to the present. Room 311, the IV line was correctly positioned. The patient's breathing was steady and appropriate. She straightened up and moved to the next room. It was Bud Hadley who noticed the intubation. He was making his morning circuit, the slow, observant loop through every floor of the building that he had been making for 4 years, when the call came through from the East Wing resuscitation room. A patient with a compromised airway equipment, partially failing the light in the room, gone due to an electrical fault that the facilities team had not yet addressed. Bud positioned himself near the door out of the way and watched. What he saw Kate Donovan do in the next 4 minutes was not what he expected to see. The positioning was the first thing, the angle of approach, the way she oriented herself to the patient before touching anything, the rapid sequential assessment airway access positioning that she ran through so fast it barely registered as a distinct sequence, just one fluid movement into the next. Then the intubation itself, the technique she used was not the technique taught in civilian nursing certification programs. It was faster, performed with greater confidence, under visual constraint, adapted for conditions where the usual reference points were unavailable. He had seen that technique before. Not in this building, not in any hospital. In a forward aid station in the Kuwaiti desert in the winter of 1991, where an Army sergeant had been attached briefly to a Marine medical element and had watched a Navy corpsman work with exactly that quality, the compressed total focus of someone for whom the body on the table was the only thing in the world that existed. Bud stood near the door and watched Kate's hands. He thought about a man he had met once, and not thought about in years. He said nothing. He continued his circuit. He stopped at the window of room 308 and looked at Harold Walsh's empty wheelchair beside the bed, and then down at the parking lot below where the morning was moving into its ordinary middle hours. He stood there longer than his circuit required. Something had shifted in the specific way things shift when a face reminds you of a face, or a gesture reminds you of a gesture, and you are not yet ready to articulate what the resemblance means or what, if anything, it requires of you. He put his hands behind his back and continued walking. He had begun very quietly to pay serious attention. Twist 2, the conversation happened at the end of Kate's shift in the East Corridor, near the supply room under fluorescent lights that were slightly too bright and slightly too yellow. Mercer appeared beside her with the timing of a man who had waited until the hallway cleared. He stood with his arms folded, a posture that communicated both authority and the specific discomfort of doing something that went against his established habits. "What you did in resuscitation today," he said. Kate waited. "That technique. Where did you learn it?" "The Marine Corps," Kate said. Mercer looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked down the corridor in both directions, the habit of a man who had learned to check his environment before saying things that mattered. 3 years ago, he said, I filed a formal complaint against Warren Cole with the board of directors. 22 documented incidents over 14 months. Physical intimidation, verbal abuse, retaliation against staff members who reported errors, falsification of performance metrics. Kate was watching him. "The complaint disappeared," Mercer said. "I received a letter from the board's legal office 6 weeks later informing me that the matter had been reviewed and closed. No details, no explanation, no record in the official files of the complaint having been received." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. He held it without offering it to her. "I kept a copy," he said. "I have kept it for 3 years because I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, and I didn't know what else to do with it." He looked at Kate directly. "I have been at this hospital for 18 years. In 18 years, I have not seen a single person refuse to look at Warren Cole. Not staff, not physicians, not administrators. Not board members who came for quarterly reviews and left satisfied with what they were shown." He paused. "You looked at him this morning into the hallway, after the clipboard. You kept your eyes on him." Kate said nothing. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Mercer said. "I'm telling you what I know so that you understand what you're dealing with. Cole didn't lose anything today. He perceives what happened as a minor embarrassment in front of staff, which means he perceives you as a problem that needs to be resolved." He put the document back in his pocket. "Whatever he's going to do, it's already in motion." He started to walk away, then he stopped. "I've also been thinking," he said, and his voice changed here, not softer but different, the change of someone admitting something they have been carrying privately for a long time, "about what I should have done in the years I've been at this facility, and what I didn't do, and whether those are the same question." He walked away. Kate stood alone in the corridor. She pressed her right hand flat against the cool wall of the building. She thought about her father. Not his words, his voice. The particular steadiness of it. The quality he had of speaking about difficult things without making them dramatic, presenting them plainly, and trusting the listener to understand their weight. She breathed the way he had taught her to breathe, deliberately using the rhythm he had shown her for moments when the situation required absolute clarity and the body wanted to do something other than be clear. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. By the third cycle, she was settled. Down the corridor in room 308, Harold Walsh had been moved back to his bed. His heart was beating steadily and his breathing was regular. His daughter, Catherine, had been called. She was in the air from Denver, due to land at San Antonio International at 9:15. She did not yet know that the woman who had adjusted her father's oxygen tube that morning, who had walked into his room without being summoned and fixed what needed fixing, and walked back out without making anything of it, was already being considered for removal by the man who ran this building. In his office on the 5th floor, Warren Cole was on the phone with his personal attorney. And in a small desk in the administrative suite 1 floor below Cole's office, a woman named Doris Haynes was sitting at her computer doing her work. She had worked in that office for 8 years. She understood, with the understanding of someone who is never in the room but is always near it, exactly what kind of man Warren Cole was. She had understood it completely for the last 2 years, since her sister died. She opened a desk drawer. She looked at what was inside it. She closed the drawer, turned back to her screen, and resumed her work. She was not ready yet, but she was getting closer. Part 2. The morning after Harold Walsh's heart stopped and started again, the 3rd floor of Harmon Veterans Medical Center felt different. Not better, not worse. Altered in the way that air is altered after lightning has passed through it, charged with something that had not yet decided what it would become. The nursing staff moved with the same careful efficiency as before, the same slightly too fast pace, the same tension held in the shoulders. But there was a new quality in the way people looked at Kate when she passed. Not the polite, faintly apologetic look of her first day. Something more complicated. The look of people who had seen something they were still processing, who were holding a question they had not yet found the shape of. She gave them nothing visible. She had work to do. The work was what mattered. She began her rounds at 7:22, 8 minutes before the official start. She moved through the East Wing, checking lines, reviewing charts, making the small, precise adjustments that accumulated over the course of a shift into the difference between adequate care and care that actually served someone. At 7:49, she stopped outside room 308. Harold Walsh was awake. He was sitting up in bed with the unhurried alertness of a man who had spent considerable time learning how to be still. His color was better. His breathing was steadier. The monitoring equipment showed numbers that were, if not perfect, meaningfully improved from the previous morning. He was looking at the photograph on the windowsill, the woman in the nurse's uniform, young from another era. Kate knocked on the open door. He turned. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He considered the question with more seriousness than most people gave it. "Like something tried to stop," he said, "and then didn't." "That's accurate." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were clear and very blue, and they had the quality of someone who had spent a long life learning to see past what people showed to what they actually were. "You were there," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," he nodded slowly. He looked at the photograph. "That's my wife," he said. "Eleanor. She was a nurse. 22 years in this kind of work." He paused. "She would have recognized you." Kate said nothing. She checked his chart, noted the overnight vitals, made a small notation. "My daughter is coming," Harold Walsh said, "flying in from Denver." "I know," Kate said. She did not say what else she knew. She had spent an hour the previous evening reviewing patient flow documentation for the past 14 months, and what she had found in that documentation, distributed across dozens of ordinary entries, invisible, unless you looked at all of them together, was something she was still assembling into its full shape. "Try to rest," she said. "Your numbers are improving." She walked back into the corridor. Twist 3. The triage flow records required a trained eye to read and a different kind of eye to understand what they meant. Kate had both. She had pulled the records during her lunch break the previous day, sitting at a break room table with a cup of coffee that went cold while she worked. The documentation was dry and administrative, the kind of material that most clinical staff never looked at because it was not their assigned function, and because the information it contained was rarely the kind you wanted to find. What the records showed across 14 months of patient admissions at Harmon VMC was a pattern. Emergency triage was supposed to operate on a standard acuity model, Patients sorted by the severity of their condition, highest acuity, moved to physician contact fastest. Not complicated, not innovative. The foundational principle of every triage system in every emergency medical setting in the country, the baseline from which everything else was built. The records showed that Harmon's system had been quietly, systematically modified. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be visible in a single case or on a single day. The modifications were small, distributed across weeks and months, calibrated to produce a specific outcome, not better patient care, but better numbers on the performance reporting metrics that determined Warren Cole's annual bonus. The key metric was door-to-physician time, minutes between patient arrival and first physician contact, a national benchmark that Harmon had been struggling to meet. Cole's bonus, a substantial figure structured into his contract through a board-approved incentive program that rewarded facility efficiency, required demonstrable improvement against that benchmark. The modification was simple and devastating. High acuity patients, the ones who needed physician contact fastest, had been quietly reclassified in the intake documentation. Not all of them, not enough to be obvious on inspection, but enough consistently applied across 14 months to move the numbers in the direction the metric required. A Category 2 patient urgent requiring physician contact within 15 minutes logged as Category 3. The clock started later. The metric improved. The bonus was paid. The patient waited longer than their condition warranted. Harold Walsh had been admitted 3 days before his cardiac arrest, with symptoms that, properly triaged, placed him clearly in Category 2. He had been logged as Category 3. He had waited. By the time the full acuity of his condition was understood, the margin for intervention had narrowed to the point where an ordinary response time would have been too late. Kate had not been ordinary. She sat in the break room and thought about 14 months of patience. She thought about everyone the system had processed before she arrived. She thought about the gap between what a veterans medical center was supposed to be and what this one had been made into, not by accident, not by negligence in the ordinary sense, but by a series of deliberate, calculated, rational decisions made by a man who had concluded that his own financial outcomes were worth more than the lives being trusted to his institution. She thought about her father. Thomas Donovan had spent his career treating the consequences of other people's decisions. He had told her about this in the evenings in Beaufort, in the careful way he had of discussing things that troubled him deeply without permitting them to become dramatic. The decisions made above his pay grade. The things optimized for metrics rather than for the human beings who were supposed to be served by those metrics. He had borne those consequences in his own body for the rest of his life. Kate closed the documentation file. She understood now what she was dealing with. This was not an administrator with a destructive temper. This was something more organized than that, more deliberate, more dangerous, a man who had made a systematic decision to harm the patients this hospital existed to serve because that decision made his professional numbers look better and his bank account larger. That changed what needed to happen. She was still thinking about this when Doris Haynes found her. Twist 4. Doris Haynes was 58 years old and had worked in the administrative suite of Harmon 5MC for 8 years, which meant she had worked for Warren Cole for 8 years, which meant she had spent 8 years in close proximity to something she could not stop, could not leave, and could not allow herself to forget. She had considered leaving, many times. The resignation letters composed during the drive home on bad evenings, elaborated during the long minutes in parking lots before she could make herself go inside. She had talked herself through the reasons she stayed, the health insurance, the pension. She was 2 years from vesting the routine that had become, if not comfortable, at least a known quantity. And the other reason, the one she did not say aloud even to herself for a long time. Her sister Margaret had come to Harmon 5MC 2 years ago. Margaret was 54. She had been a school teacher for 26 years. She had a son in college and a garden she was genuinely proud of and a laugh that occupied more space than her body did. She had come to Harmon with symptoms that 3 physicians reviewing her case afterward independently assessed as catchable, treatable with appropriate intervention at the appropriate time. She had been logged as Category 3 when her presentation warranted Category 2. She had waited. By the time the situation was fully understood, the window had closed. The error, if you use that word, if you were willing to use that word, for something embedded deliberately into a system by a deliberate hand, had been identified in the internal review. The review had produced a recommendation. The recommendation had been routed to an administrative level where someone had determined that annotation would affect facility metrics in ways that were inconsistent with performance targets. The recommendation disappeared. Doris knew all of this because she had spent 18 months finding it. 18 months of doing what she did every day, sitting near the room where decisions were made, processing the documents that flowed from those decisions being present in the background, while the foreground forgot she was there. She had collected everything, carefully, methodically, without anyone knowing. She had been waiting. She found Kate at 11:40 in the morning in the narrow hallway near the medication supply room, where the traffic was light and the camera angles left a gap. She did not say hello. She did not explain herself. She opened the small canvas bag she was carrying and removed a USB drive, standard issue, the kind available at any office supply store, and placed it in Kate's hand. Kate looked at it, then at Doris. 8 months, Doris said. Her voice was very steady, the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in private. Emails, recorded phone calls from my desk line, which is legal in Texas under one-party consent. Internal memos, triage classification logs for the past 14 months. Financial documentation linking the classification system directly to his bonus structure. Kate said nothing. There is also, Doris said, and her voice shifted slightly, here not breaking but changing the way wood changes is when pressure is applied with precision. A file about a patient named Margaret Haynes, who was my sister, who came here 2 years ago and did not leave. The hallway was quiet. I tried to report it internally, Doris said. The complaint went to the board. 6 weeks later, I received a letter telling me the matter had been reviewed and closed. Kate was still holding the USB drive. I have been waiting, Doris said, for the right person. She looked at Kate for a moment, the look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has finally found the place it was always meant to be set down. I believe you're that person, she said. She picked up her canvas bag and walked back toward the administrative suite. The afternoon moved forward, the way bad afternoons sometimes do not, quickly, not dramatically, but with the patient accumulation of pressure that builds in a building where everyone is waiting for something they cannot prevent. Cole's summons came through the official administrative channel at 2:15. A formal notification timestamped, routed through the system, the kind of summons that created a paper record of proper procedure. Cole was careful about paper records when he was moving against someone. He had done this before. He knew the architecture of a dismissal. Kate read the summons. She put the USB drive in the inside pocket of her scrub top where it rested against her ribs. She took the elevator to the 5th floor. Cole's office was large and deliberately empty of anything unnecessary. The desk held very little. The walls held very little. The window behind him looked out over the parking lot, and beyond it the flat, pale landscape of San Antonio's western edge extending toward the horizon. The space communicated control through absence, the message that everything potentially disordering had been removed. Cole was reading a document when she entered. He gestured at the chair across from his desk without looking up, the performed inattention of a man with more important things to attend to. Kate sat, he finished reading, set the document down, looked at her. You've had an eventful first week, he said. His voice was measured. The specific measurement of a man selecting his tone, the way a person selects a tool, choosing the one suited to the task at hand. I've been doing my job, Kate said. Your job has a defined scope, Cole said. It has protocols and authorization chains that exist for reasons that were established long before you arrived and will exist long after you leave. He paused. Let that settle into the air between them. I'm terminating your employment at Harmon 5MC, effective end of business today. Protocol violation, insubordination conduct incompatible with institutional standards. The paperwork will come through HR. He said this the way someone reads a list. The disinterest was deliberate. The message was, you are not significant enough to require my full attention. Kate was quiet. She breathed the way her father had taught her, the rhythm she used when the situation required absolute clarity and the body wanted to do something other than be clear. She had used it in places considerably worse than this office. She used it now. By the 3rd cycle, she was entirely steady. Cole was watching for the signals. The shoulder drop, the eyes going slightly wet, the jaw tightening in a way that preceded either argument or collapse. He was not finding them. He leaned forward slightly. Think carefully, he said, his voice shifting towards something almost avuncular, the tone of a reasonable man offering reasonable counsel about what a termination from this facility means for your career. San Antonio has a medical community. That community talks. A nurse who leaves a VA hospital under disciplinary proceedings does not have a straightforward path ahead of her. Kate said nothing. Cole's avuncular note dropped entirely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said. Kate looked at him steadily. Actually, she said, I do. She stood, walked to the door, and returned to the floor. Behind her, she heard Cole picking up his phone. Doris Haynes heard Cole's call connect from her desk in the administrative suite. She had heard hundreds of calls over 8 years. She had learned to hear without appearing to hear, to process without appearing to process, to remain in the background, where she had always been most useful. She heard Cole say in the controlled tone of a man executing a prepared procedure, "Find me grounds that will hold. I need this locked before morning." She sat for a moment without moving. Then she opened an application on her computer. A simple one. The recording function she had been using carefully and within the specific permissions of Texas one-party consent law to document conversations that came through her desk line. She placed her phone on the desk screen down. She was not the kind of person who walked into rooms and made speeches. She had never been that person. But she could do this. She could sit near the door and process what came through it and hold the record of what was said and what was chosen, hold it until it reached someone who knew what to do with it. She already knew who that person was. Twist 5, the assembly. Cole called the all-staff assembly at 9 o'clock the following morning. The announcement moved through the official channel with phrasing that gave nothing away. But the nursing staff at Harmon Vive MC had spent years learning to read Cole's administrative language the way experienced people read weather. Not from what was stated, but from the specific combination of words and timing that indicated what was coming. What was coming was not good. Lily Prescott found Kate at the nurse's station at 9:15. She was holding a chart she clearly did not need. Her face was doing the thing it always did, showing everything before she had decided to show it. "He does this," Lily said quietly, "when he wants to make an example. He put Dr. Calloway in front of the entire surgical floor 2 years ago before he forced him to resign. He put the ICU charge nurse in front of her whole team. He does it so that everyone understands." She stopped. "So that everyone understands what happens," Kate said. "Yes," Kate looked at her. "Go to the assembly. Stand somewhere you can see clearly. Don't look at the floor." Lily opened her mouth, closed it, nodded very slightly, and walked toward the auditorium. The main auditorium held 240 people when fully seated. That morning it held 183. The ones who had found reasons to be elsewhere were the ones with enough seniority to calculate the risk of absence, which was itself a measure of how the institution operated. The people with the most protection were the most able to avoid the situations that most clearly revealed why protection was necessary. The others filed in and found positions along the walls and in the seats and waited with the specific quality of waiting that comes from knowing something bad is approaching without knowing its exact shape. Bud Hadley stood near the rear entrance. Hands behind his back, the standing posture of 40 years of military habit that had never fully dissolved. He watched the room fill. He watched Kate Donovan come in and take a position near the center of the floor to the left of the main aisle. He watched her look at the stage, and then at the exits, and then at the floor for exactly 1 second before looking back up. He had made a calculation during his morning circuit. He had thought through what he knew and what he could establish, and what a 72-year-old Army veteran in a security uniform owed to the people around him. He had arrived at a position he was prepared to hold. He was going to stand here and watch what happened, and he was not going to look away. He had looked away from things before in the long middle years of his life that he did not talk about much. He was not going to do it here. Cole entered the auditorium at 9:48, 3 minutes after the official start time. He walked to the stage with the gait of a man arriving at a situation he has designed. He stood at the podium and looked out over the assembled staff for a long moment, the performance of consideration before he spoke. Yesterday and in the days preceding yesterday, this facility experienced a series of incidents involving a member of the nursing staff that represent exactly the conduct this institution cannot and will not tolerate. His voice carried well. It was one of his instruments. "Protocol exists for reasons," he said. "Chain of command exists for reasons. The culture of this facility, which I have spent 9 years building into something this community can be proud of, depends on every member of this staff understanding those reasons and operating within those structures. Without exception." He came down from the stage. The people who had seen him do this before recognized the moment. When he came down from the stage, it meant the performance was entering its second act. He walked toward Kate. The room went very quiet. Cole stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her with the careful, controlled expression of a man about to do something he has decided to do and has prepared himself for. "Your employment at this facility," he said, loud enough for the room, "is terminated effective immediately." Kate said nothing. Cole raised his hand. What happened in the next 1.8 seconds was something that 183 people in that room would describe in the weeks and months that followed to investigators and journalists and colleagues and family members at kitchen tables across San Antonio. Each description was slightly different in its details, but every single description contained the same elements: the raising of his hand, the absolute stillness of her face, and then the movement, fast, precise, total the movement of someone for whom the body had made the decision before the mind finished processing the options. And then Cole was on his knees on the floor of his own auditorium. In going down, he pulled. It was involuntary, the reflex of a large man losing balance, the body grasping for something to break the fall. His hand closed around Kate's right wrist. He pulled. She had the leverage and the control, and there was no danger of her going down. But the force of the pull at the angle it came from torqued her wrist in a direction it was not designed to move. She felt it. Not dramatic, not the kind of injury that announces itself loudly. The quiet, specific internal sensation of something that had held giving way. She released him. She stepped back. The room was completely silent. Cole was on his knees on the floor in front of every person who worked for him. Kate stood. Her right hand hung at her side. She did not look at it. She reached into her scrub pocket with her left hand and removed the ID card. It was worn at the edges. The photograph showed a younger face, same bones, same quality, of stillness in the eyes, without the particular weight that years add, and above the photograph were the words that told the room what it was looking at. United States Marine Corps, Staff Sergeant, Kate Donovan, Combat Medic. She held it so the room could see. No one spoke. 183 people stood in the silence Cole had built over 9 years and felt it change around them, not collapsing, but shifting the forces, redistributing the balance, finding a new relationship to everything else. At the back of the room, Bud Hadley stood with his hands behind his back. He did not look away. The hand was not going to be the same. Kate knew this with the functional clarity of her training, not emotionally, not dramatically, but as a piece of assessed information. She stood in the auditorium and held the ID card and felt the specific, dull, insistent signal in her right hand that would over the following days be confirmed as a partial rupture of the ulnar collateral ligament with associated tendon involvement. The orthopedic specialist who reviewed the imaging would tell her in the careful language of someone delivering unwelcome information with precision that the prognosis for full fine motor recovery was uncertain, that the specific movements required for advanced clinical procedures, the small, precise manipulations at the technical heart of skilled nursing, might not return to their previous baseline. She would look at the x-rays and hear her father's voice. Use your hands to heal. She had made that promise, and she had kept it. She understood this in the clear, functional way she understood other things. She had healed something today in this room with these hands in ways that had nothing to do with IV lines or intubation tubes. The cost of it was written permanently into her body, and she would carry it forward the way her father had carried what Kuwait had written into his, not as a defeat, as the price of a decision that had been worth making. She lowered the ID card, she looked at the room, and she waited for what came next. Part 3. The silence in the auditorium was not empty. It had weight and texture and a character that none of the 183 people inside it would forget. The silence of a held breath, collective, involuntary, the kind that happens when a room full of people witnesses something their bodies understood before their minds did. Warren Cole was on his knees on the floor. Kate Donovan was standing above him, right hand at her side, ID card in her left. And then, because silences like that one cannot hold indefinitely, because the human need to speak is one of the oldest needs, there is something began. It began with Lily Prescott. She was standing near the left wall, exactly where Kate had told her to stand, in a position where she could see. She had done what Kate said. She had not looked at the floor. She had watched everything from the moment Cole raised his hand to the moment his knees hit the auditorium floor, and she had held it all inside her without moving, the way you hold a lit match and wait to understand which way the wind is going. She took one step forward. That was all. One step out of the line she had been standing in into the open space of the center aisle. She was 24 years old. She had been at this hospital for 2 years, and she had cried in supply closets and gone home with her hands shaking and told herself this was just how things were. This was the job. This was what you accepted if you wanted to keep working. She took one step forward and said, "He threw a clipboard at my face." Her voice was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was just her voice, the ordinary voice of a 24-year-old woman stating a factual thing in a room full of people who had been in the hallway when it happened. Then a lab technician named Gordon Price, 41 years old, quiet by nature, not a man who would have called himself brave. He shoved me into a wall in September, over a mislabeled specimen, in front of 3 people, then a floor nurse named Vivian, then an orderly named Marcus, then a surgical resident whose voice broke once in the middle of what he was saying and who kept going anyway. They did not speak all at once. They did not speak like people who had rehearsed. They spoke the way water moves when a barrier gives not in a single surge but in the accumulation of small movements that become collectively something that cannot be stopped. Cole was still on one knee preparing to rise. Something about the room, something in the character of what was happening and around him, had told him in the way power recognizes its own erosion that rising was not going to improve his position. Dr. Garrett Mercer had not moved since Cole went down. He was standing in the center right section of the floor where he had positioned himself when he came in, watching the room with the expression of a man who had been carrying a calculation in his mind for a long time and was now watching the answer resolve. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, removed the folded document he had kept for 3 years, walked to the edge of the stage. Catherine Walsh was there. She had arrived at San Antonio International at 9:15 as scheduled. She had been redirected to the auditorium by a member of the nursing staff who had said simply, "Go to the main auditorium," and offered no further explanation. She had gone. She was 53 years old, and she had chaired the board of this facility for 6 years, and she had signed off on Cole's performance evaluations and his bonus structure and his contract renewals, and she had received 3 years ago a formal complaint against him that had been routed through the board's legal office and returned to her marked, reviewed, and closed. She had accepted that determination. She had not asked what it meant. Mercer placed the document at the edge of the stage in front of her. He did not hand it to her. He set it down and stepped back and let it be what it was. She looked at it. She looked at the room. In the corner of the auditorium, Harold Walsh sat in a wheelchair. A night nurse had made the decision without authorization and without hesitation to bring him here when the assembly was called. He was sitting with his large, weathered hands in his lap, watching the room with the patient attention of a man who had lived long enough to understand that the most important things happened in ordinary rooms on ordinary mornings. Catherine Walsh looked at her father. She straightened. She walked to the center of the stage. Twist 5, Clifford Doyle had been in San Antonio for 9 days. He was 61, a reporter with the San Antonio Tribune for 22 years. He had been investigating Harmon 5MC for 4 months following a tip from a former employee that had led to a careful accumulation of sources and documentation that was very nearly sufficient to publish almost but not quite. He had needed one thing: the moment when private institutional behavior became publicly visible in a way that could not be managed or routed through a legal office and returned marked closed. He had been in the auditorium for 12 minutes before Cole raised his hand. He had what he needed. But what he said to Catherine Walsh in the 60 seconds after Mercer placed the document in front of her was about something else. 40 minutes earlier, in the parking structure adjacent to the facility, Cole's personal attorney had placed a phone call to a board member, not Catherine Walsh. A different member, one whose name appeared in sealed correspondence Doyle had been working to access, and had said with the calm efficiency of a man executing a prepared plan that the situation needed to be contained before it reached external media. Doyle had not been in the parking structure, but Doris Haynes' recording software had been running for 40 minutes, and her desk line had the extension Cole's attorney used when contacting the board directly, and the conversation had come through it like everything else came through it, recorded, filed, held. He told Catherine Walsh what had been said. She listened. Behind her, the room was still filling with voices, careful, factual, specific, saying things that had needed to be said for years. She looked at the document Mercer had placed in front of her. She looked at the room. She looked at her father. "I need to speak," she said. She walked to the center of the stage. The room settled into quiet, the way rooms quiet when authority genuinely shifts, not snapping to silence, but arriving there, the individual voices completing what they needed to say, and then waiting. "I am Catherine Walsh," she said. "I chair the board of directors of this facility." She paused, not theatrically, but with precision, the pause of a person choosing words that needed to be exactly right. "What I have witnessed this morning and what I am being told about actions taken within the last hour to prevent an accurate account of this testimony from reaching appropriate parties constitutes conduct the board cannot and will not support." She looked at Cole, who had finally gotten to his feet. He was standing near the front of the floor with his suit jacket slightly disheveled, the first time in 9 years anyone in this building had seen Warren Cole with anything out of place. "Warren," she said, "you are suspended effective immediately pending investigation. You will be accompanied by security." She looked back at the room. "I know this is not enough," she said. "I know that saying we failed you, while accurate, does not return what was taken from the people in this room over the past 9 years. But it is true. And it is the beginning of something different." She paused. "That has to start today. Right now, with everyone in this room." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Twist 6, Bud Hadley walked to the front of the room after Catherine Walsh finished speaking. He waited until the immediate noise subsided, and then he spoke directly to her and to Clifford Doyle, who had moved close enough to hear. What he said was this: 3 years ago, during a county facilities upgrade, a secondary camera system had been installed on the exterior of Harmon 5MC. 4 units positioned to cover the parking structure and the external emergency entrances. The installation had been contracted through the County Facilities Management Office and had not been routed through Cole's administrative approval process. Cole did not know the system existed. The system operated on a 30-day rolling archive. In the ordinary course of events, footage older than 30 days was overwritten and lost. But the system was connected to the county network, and the county network had, as a matter of routine data policy, been archiving the feed to an offsite server since the day of installation. 3 years of footage. The internal cameras Cole had manipulated or destroyed after specific incidents covered the corridors and administrative spaces, the places he had been careful about. The external system covered the parking structure and the emergency entrance corridor. The overlap between interior and exterior coverage was wider than anyone had calculated when the system was designed. 3 years of what had actually happened at Harmon Veterans Medical Center, preserved on a county server that Warren Cole had never known existed. Bud handed Clifford Doyle a document with the county network archival reference numbers. Doyle looked at the numbers. He looked at Bud. "How long have you known about this?" Bud said. "Long enough to know when it mattered." He walked back to the rear of the room. Cole was escorted from the auditorium by 2 members of the security staff and a representative from the Bayard County Sheriff's Office. He walked through the auditorium and through the corridor and through the main entrance of Harmon Veterans Medical Center without speaking. At the doors he stopped. He turned back toward the building, toward the hallway visible through the glass where people were watching him leave. His expression had moved through several phases in the past 40 minutes and had arrived at something flat and unreadable that was perhaps worse than all the expressions that had preceded it. He had something to say. Everyone watching him could see that. The jaw, the set of the eyes, the particular position of his body, all of it said that words had been prepared. He did not say them. He turned and got into the waiting vehicle. The doors closed. Kate was in the corridor outside the auditorium when Bud Hadley found her. She had left while the formal proceedings were still ongoing, while Catherine Walsh was taking statements and Doyle was on the phone and Mercer was standing with his arms folded, watching everything with the expression of a man who had waited 3 years for a specific door to open and was not entirely sure how to feel about standing on the other side of it. She had left because her hand needed attention and because the room no longer required her presence. What happened next in that auditorium was going to happen with or without her, and the hand was a more immediate problem. She was leaning against the corridor wall with her back straight and her right hand cradled carefully against her chest when Bud came through the auditorium door. He walked to where she was standing. He did not move quickly. He never moved quickly. He had the gait of a man who had learned over a long life that the distance between 2 points was less important than the quality of attention you brought to covering it. He stopped beside her. He looked at her hand. He said nothing about it. He had known what he was going to say since the morning he stood outside the door of the East Wing resuscitation room and watched her hands work through a technique that did not come from any civilian training program in the country. He had known it, and he had waited the way he waited for things that needed their right moment, because speaking too early was the same as not speaking at all. He stood beside her in the corridor, not quite facing her, the posture of men of his generation and background, when they were preparing to say something that mattered. Not building toward it, not making it a performance. Just arriving at it in their own time in the way of people who had learned that some things deserved to be said plainly and said once. One note. "Your father would recognize what you just did," he said. Kate was very still. "I served with Thomas Donovan," Bud said. "Not long, 6 weeks during Desert Storm. I was Army. He was Navy corpsman attached to a Marine element, but the forward aid station his unit used was the same one my battalion ran through on the push into Kuwait." He paused. "He was the best medical person I saw in that theater, and I saw a lot of them in a lot of conditions. He looked straight down the corridor at the nothing in particular that was there. He had that thing you have, Bud said, where the room changes when the situation requires it, where the uncertainty just goes and what remains is only what needs to happen. He paused again. I recognized it when I watched you work in that resuscitation room. The technique, the quality of the focus. I knew what I was looking at. I just didn't know why it looked familiar until I thought about it. He turned and looked at her now. He would recognize it, he said. That's all. Kate was looking at the floor. Not the way people look at the floor to avoid something. The way people look at a fixed point when they are holding themselves together with great care and are fully aware of exactly how much effort that requires. She took a slow breath. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. The rhythm her father had given her for moments when the situation required absolute steadiness and the body had other ideas. Thank you, she said. Bud nodded once. He put his hands behind his back. He resumed his corridor walk, moving in the direction of the east wing at the unhurried pace of a man with a circuit to complete. Kate watched him go. Then she turned toward the nurse's station to find someone who could look at her hand. Behind her, through the auditorium doors, the sound of voices continued, careful, factual, specific, the sound of people saying things that had waited a long time to be said. Twist 7. The federal investigator's name was Philip Cord. He was 47 with the compact economical presentation of someone who had spent a career in government service. He came to Harmon 5MC on the afternoon of March 14th, 4 hours after Cole had been escorted from the building, and he found Kate in the small conference room where she had spent the past 2 hours providing a recorded statement to a county investigator. He waited until the county investigator was finished. Then he knocked, came in, and sat across from her. He placed a folder on the table between them. He did not open it. I work for the Office of the Inspector General, he said, Department of Defense. He paused. We've been running an investigation into a network of VA-affiliated medical facilities for 18 months. 7 facilities across 4 states. The pattern is consistent across all of them. Triage, classification, manipulation, performance, metric falsification, financial incentive, structures that prioritize institutional numbers over patient outcomes. Kate looked at the folder. Harmon VMC is one of the 7, Cord said. Warren Cole is not an isolated case. He is a link in a network of contracting arrangements and administrative appointments that extends considerably above any individual facility director. He opened the folder. Inside was a document dated September 4th of the previous year. She looked at the letterhead. She looked at the date. She looked at the name at the top of the page. Her name. We approached you 6 months ago, Cord said. We needed someone at Harmon VMC with the clinical qualifications to identify and document the patient care pattern. Someone with he selected the word carefully, the constitution to operate in that environment without being neutralized by it. You met every criterion. He looked at her. You agreed to transfer to Harmon, you worked the floor, you built the clinical documentation. The triage records you identified and that Doris Haynes's materials corroborate that is the evidentiary foundation we needed. He closed the folder. What happened in the auditorium this morning, he said, was not in our plan. Kate said nothing. I want to be clear about that, Cord said. The plan was documentation evidence and a referral to federal prosecution. Procedural and clean. What you did this morning. He stopped. He looked at the bandaging on her right hand. That was your decision, not ours. The conference room was quiet. Kate looked at the folder. She thought about what Cord had said, that what happened in the auditorium was not part of anyone's plan, and she thought about what had actually happened. Cole had raised his hand to strike her in front of 183 people, and her body had decided before her mind finished the sentence. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had taught her, not in formal lessons, not in the specific instruction, but in the accumulation of his whole life, demonstrated in front of her over the years she had known him. That all the training and preparation and careful construction of skill and discipline resolved eventually into a single unrehearsed moment that showed you what you had actually become, that you could not plan the moment. You could only build the person. She had spent 6 years in the Marine Corps building the person. Cole had raised his hand and the person had responded. What happens now, she asked. Cord picked up the folder. Federal charges against Cole. The clinical documentation, Doris Haynes's recordings, the county archival footage. It's a substantial case. The network above him will take longer. The other 6 facilities are at various stages. He paused. Your documentation methodology, the way you identified and built the clinical pattern, would be useful to the teams working the other sites as a consultant, if you're willing. Kate looked at her bandaged hand. I'll think about it, she said. Cord stood. He moved to the door. He stopped. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice had moved away from its professional register into something less managed. What you did in that corridor 2 days ago, the code blue, the cardiac patient. He paused. That wasn't in anyone's plan either. You just did it because it needed doing. He left. Kate sat alone in the conference room. Outside the window, San Antonio was continuing its ordinary afternoon in the flat, clear winter light, indifferent to the weight of what had happened inside this building today. Cars moved through the parking lot. A maintenance worker crossed the lot, slowly, hands in his pockets. The city's ordinary life proceeding in all the ways it always did, which was itself a kind of reassurance, the confirmation that the world extended past any single building's crisis and would continue past it into whatever came next. She sat for a long time. The weeks that followed were quieter than the morning that preceded them, which was not the same as being easy. Federal charges against Warren Cole were filed on March 22nd, salt healthcare fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts related to the systematic destruction of evidence. The Bexar County Sheriff's Office filed parallel state charges. Cole's attorney issued a statement. No one at Harmon VMC read it. The Board of Directors issued a public statement on March 19th, authored by Catherine Walsh, which acknowledged institutional failure at the board level, accepted accountability for the years of inadequate oversight, and committed to a comprehensive independent review of policies and practices dating back to Cole's appointment. The statement did not use the language of minimization or redirection. It said what it needed to say in direct, unambiguous sentences, unusual enough in institutional communications, that 3 regional outlets commented on it specifically. Doris Haynes's recordings were entered into evidence. 8 months of audio combined with the clinical documentation Kate had compiled in the 3 years of county network archival footage produced a case that the federal prosecutor's office described in internal communications as unusually complete. The board established a temporary administrative structure while a permanent director search was conducted. Catherine Walsh remained as chair. She had a conversation with Garrett Mercer that neither of them described in detail to anyone else, and at the end of it, Mercer agreed to serve on the interim oversight committee. On March 28th, a reform proposal was circulated among senior clinical staff. It addressed the triage classification system, restoring the standard acuity model without exception. It redesigned the performance metric structure, removing the bonus incentive framework tied to throughput numbers and replacing it with a compensation structure linked to patient outcome measures. It established a new internal reporting pathway that bypassed facility administration, entirely routing to an independent ethics committee with binding review authority and a mandatory response timeline. It required signatures from senior clinical staff to proceed. Garrett Mercer was the first to sign. He did not make a speech. He did not mark the occasion with ceremony. He picked up the pen, wrote his name in his careful physician's hand, set the pen down, and walked back to his rounds. That was enough. By the end of the following week, the proposal had 47 signatures. The triage system was suspended and rebuilt from the ground up. The performance metric structure was redesigned. The bonus incentive framework was eliminated. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened without friction. There were disagreements and complications and days when the work of rebuilding something inside the damage of what had preceded it was more exhausting than anyone had anticipated. Some staff members had been at Harmon so long that the old culture was the only institutional culture they knew, and learning new patterns required unlearning ones that had been automatic for years. But it happened, slowly and imperfectly and without ceremony, the way real change happens. It happened. In room 308, Harold Walsh remained for 10 more days before transferring to a rehabilitation facility. On his last morning, he asked a floor nurse to deliver a message to Kate. The message was 3 words: "You were there." Kate received it at the nurse's station. She folded the piece of paper twice and put it in her pocket and returned to her charts. The phone call came on the evening of April 3rd at 7:42. Kate was at her kitchen table and right hand elevated a medical journal open in front of her that she was not reading. The Phoenix area code was unfamiliar. "Is this Kate Donovan?" A woman's voice. Clear, professional, carrying underneath it a specific quality, the controlled presentation of someone who had been holding something carefully for a long time. "Yes," Kate said. "My name is Nora Briggs. I'm a charge nurse at Whitmore Veterans Medical Centers in Phoenix." A pause. "I read the Tribune piece about what happened at Harmon." A colleague forwarded it. Another pause. I need to talk to someone who will understand what I'm going to describe. Kate was quiet for a moment. She reached across the table with her left hand. She picked up the pen beside the journal. She pulled a notepad toward her. Tell me what's happening, she said. Nora Briggs talked for 40 minutes. She described a facility that mirrored Harmon 5MC in ways that were too specific to be coincidental. The culture of intimidation, the documentation anomalies, the gap between what the performance report showed and what the staff experienced on the floor every day. She described a director whose management of fear was so practiced and so complete that the staff had stopped being able to imagine the possibility of his removal. She described a year of watching it, of collecting what documentation she could without knowing exactly what pattern she was looking for, of reading the Tribune article and going back through the records with new eyes and finding the same shape underneath the numbers. Kate wrote with her left hand. The handwriting was slower, slightly uneven. The letters not quite the shape she intended, but the words were legible. The details were clear. She wrote down everything Nora described with the same methodical attention she had brought to the triage records at Harmon. Not reacting, not interpreting yet, receiving and recording. When Nora finished, there was a silence on the line. I don't know what to do, Nora said. If I go internal, it disappears. If I go outside, he'll know it was me. He has ways of making people understand that there will be consequences. I know, Kate said. I've been watching this for a year, Nora said. I have some documentation. Not enough. I didn't know what I was looking for until the article explained what the pattern looked like. Her voice tightened slightly, then steadied. How did you do it? How did you walk in there knowing what it was going to be? Kate thought about this. My father told me something, she said. He spent his career treating people who had been hurt by decisions made above them. He said the hardest part was never the treatment itself. The hardest part was walking back into the same conditions, knowing exactly what they were and doing the work anyway. She paused. He said the work was the answer. Not to the system. You can't fix a system by treating patients. But the work was the answer to the question of who you were going to be while you were trying to fix the system. The line was quiet. Use your hands to heal, Kate said. That's what he told me. I'll start building the documentation tomorrow, Nora said. Good. And Nora, you're not doing this alone. Call me when you have the first 30 days compiled. I'll connect you with the OIG team. She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. She looked at her right hand wrapped in the brace the orthopedic specialist had fitted 4 days ago. The prognosis remained uncertain, the specialist's careful word for a range of outcomes that included meaningful recovery and did not exclude something permanent. The fine motor precision, the specific physical language of advanced clinical work, the capability her father had asked her to use in service of healing, all of it, still uncertain. She moved the fingers of her right hand slowly. The movement was stiff and slightly wrong, the way a familiar room looks wrong after the furniture has been moved. She would spend the next months finding out what remained. She closed the journal. She turned off the kitchen light. Outside the window, San Antonio's nighttime cityscape spread out in its familiar arrangement, the lights steady and indifferent, and somehow comforting in their indifference. She sat in the dark for a while, then she went to bed. The photograph was hung in the main corridor of Harmon Veterans Medical Center on the morning of April 7th. It was a black and white image, 8 by 10 in a simple dark frame. It showed a desert landscape, flat pale, the horizon shimmering with the heat distortion of the Kuwaiti plain in the winter of 1991. In the foreground, a man in military uniform was kneeling beside another man on the ground. The standing figure was 27 years old, sleeves rolled precisely, equipment positioned with the care of someone for whom the organization of tools was the first act of any procedure. His hands were moving over the man on the ground with absolute total focus, the focus of someone for whom the body in front of them was the only thing in the world that existed. The nameplate below the photograph said HM2, Thomas Donovan, Navy Corpsman, Operation Desert Storm, Kuwait, 1991. Beneath the nameplate in handwriting that was slightly uneven because it had been written with the left hand by someone still learning to make the left hand do what the right had always done, were 5 words. Use your hands to heal. Kate was in the corridor when Eldon, the facilities manager, a quiet man who had worked at Harmon for 12 years and who had filed 2 of the earliest complaints against Cole that had subsequently disappeared, finished hanging the photograph and stepped back. He looked at it for a moment. He nodded once to her, or to the photograph, or to both, and put his tools away and went back to his work. Lily Prescott passed through the corridor on her way to the East Wing 20 minutes later. She slowed when she saw the photograph. She read the nameplate. She read the handwriting. She looked at Kate. She didn't say anything. She nodded, the kind of nod that carries more than nods usually carry, the kind that substitutes for a sentence that would not have been adequate anyway. Then she continued to the East Wing. Bud Hadley came through on his morning circuit at 8:43. He stopped in front of the photograph. He stood looking at it for a long time. He looked at the young man kneeling in the desert, at the way his hands moved in the image, with such complete and purposeful direction, at the quality of attention in the posture, the same quality that Kate had in the corridor. Oh no. When Cole raised his hand, the quality Bud had recognized because he had seen it 33 years ago in a forward aid station in Kuwait, in a man whose daughter had just walked into a building and done what needed doing. He stood there long enough that two nurses who passed behind him gave him a second look. He did not notice them. He was looking at the photograph. Then he put his hands behind his back and resumed his circuit, East Wing first, then North Corridor, then the long loop back through the administrative wing, the route he had walked every morning for 4 years, steady and unhurried, and present the way he planned to walk it for as long as they would have him. Kate stood in the corridor after Bud moved on. The building around her was doing what it had been slowly doing for the past 3 weeks, returning to something it had perhaps always been capable of being before the pressure of one man's particular variety of power had compressed it into something smaller and worse. Not dramatic, not overnight. The change was visible in small things, the volume of voices in the hallways which had come back to its natural register. The posture of the nursing staff which no longer carried the specific weight of people bracing for something to arrive. The quality of movement through the building, which was the quality of people doing their work, rather than the quality of people surviving their environment. It was not fixed. It would not be fixed quickly. The reforms that had been put in place were the architecture of something better. Not the thing itself. The thing itself would take years to build and would require from every person in the building the specific daily commitment to holding it. But the architecture was there. The foundation was real. Kate looked at the photograph of her father. She looked at his hands, young and precise, and entirely certain of what they were doing, moving over a man in the Kuwaiti desert with the focus of someone for whom nothing else in the world existed in that moment. She thought about the promise she had made. She had made it in a hospital room in Beaufort on a summer afternoon in 2017, holding her father's hand with both of hers, looking at a man who was leaving and who wanted to know that something of himself would continue forward in ways that mattered. Use your hands to heal. She had thought for years that she understood what the promise meant, the IV lines and the intubation and the compressions and the medications and the thousand small, precise acts of clinical care that kept bodies functioning and people alive in their bodies. She had thought the promise lived in those actions, in the technical command of her hands over the instruments of healing. She understood now that it was larger than that. Her father had known this. He had spent a career treating bodies in conditions shaped by decisions made above him, and he had understood, in the way that people who have spent years inside broken systems understand, that healing was not only what happened to the person on the table, it was also what happened in the room around the table, in the institution around the room, in the people who were there watching and waiting and deciding moment by moment what kind of person they were going to be. Sometimes healing meant holding someone's hand and saying they were going to be all right. And sometimes it meant standing in a room where fear had lived for a decade and refusing to look away. She had made the same promise in both cases. She looked at her right hand. She flexed the fingers, slowly feeling the stiffness and the wrongness of the movement, the altered landscape of her own hand that she was still learning to navigate. The orthopedic specialist had said uncertain. She had been living with uncertain for 3 weeks now. Some days the movement was better than it had been the day before. Some days it was exactly the same. She was learning to work with what she had. She was learning to write with her left hand. She was learning which procedures she could still perform with full confidence and which ones she needed to approach differently and which ones she would need for now to let other hands manage. She was learning that this was not a failure of the promise, but an extension of it, that the promise had never been only about the precision of the right hand, but about the direction of both hands toward whatever healing required in the moment it required it. Her father's hands had trembled in the last years too. The neurological damage slow and patient and irresistible. He had continued working with what he had until he couldn't anymore, and he had never presented it as anything other than what it was, the cost of having been in the places he had been and done the things he had done, a cost he had paid without resentment because the things he had done had been worth doing. She was her father's daughter. She straightened. She looked at the photograph one more time, at his young face and profile, at the total absorption of his posture, at the quality of presence in his hands, and she felt for the first time since the afternoon in the auditorium something that was close to peace. Not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of everything that remained uncertain, but the specific piece of understanding where you are and why you are there and what the work in front of you is and why it matters. She turned away from the photograph. She walked back down the corridor toward the east wing where her patients were waiting. Her shift had started 17 minutes ago. There was work to do. And 2,000 miles away in Phoenix, Arizona, a charge nurse named Nora Briggs was sitting at a desk in a facility that looked in ways that were too specific to be coincidental, very much like Harmon Veterans Medical Center had looked 6 weeks ago. She was opening patient flow records. She was beginning to build a documentation file page by careful page. She was not alone. She had been told she was not alone. And in a government building in Washington, D.C., in the office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, a folder sat on a desk with a label that said, Whitmore Veterans Medical Center, Site 2. The work was ongoing. It had never been only about one building. It had never been only about one man. It was about what happens inside institutions when accountability disappears and fear moves in to fill the space that accountability left behind. And it was about what happens when someone walks through the door who has learned from a father who carried the weight of his country's decisions in his own body until it killed him, that the most important thing is not to look away. The most important thing is to stay and do the work. Use your hands to heal. The corridor was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar note. The building moved through its morning with the slightly different quality it had been developing for 3 weeks. Not transformed, not finished, but changed in the ways that matter, in the direction of something better, one ordinary day at a time. Kate Donovan walked toward her patients. Her right hand wrapped in its brace hung at her side. Her left hand was free.